telling when Ashok responded to my POI by saying, well, if the Maldives will go underwater, then the IT industry won't help fix it. So what happens in cases where, like during the Asian tsunami, people didn't want to visit Phuket, and that area was hit by a financial crisis because they thought it was too risky to go there. The problem with their logic is that they have absolutely no vulnerability analysis. And they have absolutely no idea of why we want to shield markets precisely from the kind of vulnerability that is intrinsic to the tourism industry. Things that we felt were not mutually exclusive to other industries, which is why we were willing to say countries like Maldives, countries like Thailand and Argentina should move toward pursuing other types of economic policies. Maybe some of them would want trying to transition into an agricultural economy. Others would want to go into manufacturing. Others would want to become service-oriented. There is a steady demand for these things all around the world, and the demand is not as vulnerable as is the case with tourism. Basically, the question of this debate is what makes a sustainable, egalitarian, and long-term development plan. I'm going to analyze this on 3 levels. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to conduct a vulnerability analysis for you. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about how it's, egalitarian. And the third thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about environmental protection. Fourth thing I'm going to do is talk to you about diversification and innovation. Let's talk about the first idea. I'm going to talk about vulnerability. Because aside from asserting that the Macanese and Las Vegas economies didn't actually die during the financial crisis, we didn't see any analysis about A, why this is the case, B, why it will continue to be the case. We told you even if you still had a lot of money going into Maldives and going into other places, this money wasn't funneled to the society anyway. And this money, they actually experienced decreases in their growth. They didn't earn $400 billion. Actually, no country earns $400 billion in net profits a year. Please don't make things up. I'm a development studies teacher. The next thing you need to talk about is actually whether or not these economies will remain so stable. It's a basic economic policy. In times of economic principle, in times of economic crisis, the amount of money people spend on non-food items decreases exponentially. Actually, it's not inelastic demand because to people who don't have a lot of money to spare, sometimes it just makes more sense to spend the weekend in your country eating a bag of chips instead of jetting off to another country. Because not everyone is Bill Gates and not everyone has, the total assets of Donald Trump. If you want to build your economy in that isn't a very smart, sustainable move. The next thing we need to talk about is they said, well, first of all, it makes money. Why can't we channel funds into it? Because they didn't understand. We told you quite clearly, coming even from sex, that you have to understand the limitations of the world we exist in. The government has limited funds to channel into these things. The state has limited natural resources. And there's also a limited demand for environmental, for the consumption of that kind of food in the first place. This is where the second idea comes in. Environmental protection. They never responded to any of CES's analysis about protecting the environment. We told you clearly that ecotourism actually degrades the environment because for as long as you have any sort of interaction with human beings, especially human beings who have about a dozen beaches to choose from, you're forced to make the deal as sweet as possible. How precisely do you innovate the tourism industry? A, you make it cheaper, which cuts down on your ability to maintain these things. B, you allow them entrance farther and farther into the caves. You allow them more and more room to go into your virgin forests. You allow skydiving and jet skiing and all kinds of things that are bad for the environment. You knock down hectares of land so you can build a hotel, knock down hectares of trees, I'm sorry, so you can build a hotel right in the center of this clearing with a beautiful lake. All of these are things that are bad for the environment. And things that you have to do, competition you have to make, because it's not true that only one country in the world has a beautiful beach. Guys, I'm sorry, Thailand has beaches, Maldives has beaches, Sri Lanka has beaches, the Philippines has beaches, Mexico has beaches. When people don't want to go to Hawaii, they go to Cancun, they go to Mexico. So we think that it's a big point that you guys totally did not respond to. So we think that eventually, even if the demand will not run out, which we think it does, your resources will stop being so pretty. Eventually, you will have less trees. That's why the Amazon isn't as pretty. That's why you see people entering new markets and saying, well, we want to look at this thing because this thing is now more of the innovation. This thing is the more undiscovered virgin territory. We think that eventually runs out in a bit. The next thing I want to talk about is this idea of egalitarianism and what's really best for society. Because they talked to us about the massive GDP growth. We think GDP is an awful number to measure the growth of your society by. Yeah, go ahead.
If I wish to go into manufacturing now, wouldn't I need to clear a whole bunch of forests to make space for factories to arise?
No, we think they have lots of land actually, clear tracts of land, and you don't need lots of land even to do manufacturing. You need buildings for that. You have spaces that are not cultural heritage sites. You don't have to clear the beautiful mountains to do that. You can just turn to your industrial urban areas. Maldives isn't exactly an island full of trees, guys. Come on. We think GDP is an awful number to measure economic growth and economic development by, because that amount of money doesn't necessarily go to the people alone. We told you it goes toward the hotels. That's why if you look at the numbers of inequality in Maldives, in Cancun, in Hawaii, they're quite high, because this means that the people who were rich enough to purchase rights to these areas and put up hotels there aren't exactly the kinds of people who profit from it. That's why we wanted to shift to something like agriculture or manufacturing, because it's something that more people can participate in and profit from. You don't just have the manufacturer owner actually making money. You have his employees and the people who create their career ladders in there making money as well. We think there was a limited demand for employment under a tourism-dependent economy, one where the other fringe industries that come up, like your public toilets, are dependent on people continuing to want to go there. So if people suddenly decide for some reason they don't want to go there anymore, your entire country collapses. We don't think any country should be vulnerable to that. Thank you. We thank the government with the follow the opposition with.
Two very important questions in this debate. Firstly, how best do we protect the environment? And secondly, I think this is really crucial, is when do we give up on tourism and let it slowly decline away? First question, how best do we protect the environment? I think this is a great debate, right? Because we went all the way down to talk about how comparative advantage will alter how countries treat the reserves. But ladies and gentlemen, if you take a look at comparative advantage specific to ecotourism, for example, the Great Barrier Reef, after National Geographic actually talked about the degradation because of the tourist footprint at that particular area, Australia actually stepped up its effort to restore and to repair all these Great Barrier Reef pictures. But more importantly, we also talk about how they started cordoning off areas and making sure that at least these areas are still protected away from people, because people not only go there because they can touch that place, but also to go there because they are camp hosts and they want to take photographs. If a Great Barrier Reef that's full of holes, I don't think you really want to go there. And when the National Tourism Board actually examines whether or not it's going to deter more people from coming in, they actually take into consideration the quality of the experience that they go down there to. But most importantly, we want to talk about how, when it comes to how best do we protect the environment, we need to realize that our tourism and empty promises do not work. Economic incentive is extremely important. Let us take a look at economic incentive in the world of the proposition. Economic incentive in a world where there is less reliance or there is less activation of tourism industry naturally means that you have to go into other sectors. For example, you have to start building your manufacturing industries, your factories, so on and so forth. So in this case, there's going to probably be a competition between the environment and your economy. Because the more forests you maintain under that policy, it means that the less you can expand your factories. That's the first response. The second response really is that the people will always be asking the government, since we are no longer using it as a tourist industry, why don't we make full use of their particular pieces of land to the maximum advantage? Because now the quality of life after they have moved away from tourists is probably going to be lower, their salaries are lower. So they definitely want to say, oh, we should go on a full rampage and expansion of the industry so that at least my pay goes back to its original amount. This is the kind of mentality that is on the ground, and then it will translate into government policies. And as we have seen all over the world today, whenever people do not have economic incentive to protect the environment, disastrous consequences happen. For example, the slash and burn strategy by the loggers. Because the government at their places do not really want to protect the environment. Because do you know why? Because it takes so much money for them to have all these petroleum officers to stop the farmers from just randomly slashing and burning. But in our case, when these industries, the tourism industry is directly affected by the environmental degradation, government has every incentive to patrol these areas to protect the quality of the experience. No, thank you. But the second question, which is most important, is when do we give up on tourism and let it slowly decline away? Actually, there can only be two things, right? Two reasons for that. First is when the tourism industry itself is extremely problematic. But second, which is just as important, is if we have a good alternative that we can transition to. First question, is it extremely problematic? Actually, you know what, when I was a secondary school debater, I always thought about how tourism is a very vulnerable industry. But after a while, when I study more and more of economics, I start to realize the nuances behind the environmental tourism. Let me give you a few examples. I think the first thing is to take a look at the target audience. As compared to like manufacturing industries whereby you only have one, sometimes you do not trade with so many countries, you only have one or two trading partners. When it comes to the tourism industry, the entire world, the entire audience is your target audience here. Because like your country is open to any tourist, any foreigner from any place to come over as long as they have the financial ability to do so. So first, the target audience is far greater than most of the industries that we have. The second reason why I think that when it comes to tourism, it's not as vulnerable as they would like to make it very simplistic, right? It's because when it comes to regional or even global recession, we need to realize that yes, as much as a lot of people say things are bad, but there are still many rich people, the upper middle class out there who are not that affected by the tourism industry. That goes to, and how do I know that? It's because when I take a look at the tourist statistics of the Maldives, or Vegas, or even in Asia, the Bali, so and so forth, what we do actually realize is yes, there was a drop, but there was not a complete collapse of that particular industry, because there are still many middle and upper class people going there. But by the way, I just want to make fun of them, right? I mean, and when in times of so-called economic crisis, less people will go there. But in times of economic boom, most people will start going there. Do you know why? Because after 1 or 2 years of not going overseas, you start to have the itch of going overseas. So that's my second tier. But the third tier that I really want to talk about is that okay, this is a fluffy point, but the human curiosity to explore the world causes people to travel overseas for a wide variety of reasons. Sometimes people just use the excuse of business opportunities to go overseas. Sometimes all of us here pretend that we are here serious about debating and we come over to Macau, where actually we are interested in casinos. Sometimes people like Usher Wang, who's probably going to go for a postgraduate trip. Whatever, they will just find a reason or to celebrate their I don't know, whatever, just so that they can go overseas. And at the end of the day, I think the fourth thing I can really talk about, why is it not so vulnerable? Because actually families take tourism, I know maybe this is an excuse, as like maybe an educational tour for the children, and they go together and spend a good family time. I mean, all these things are constants. You can't tell me that people will start being sick of going overseas, right? Because when I was a kid, I wanted to go to America. Even right now, I still want to go to America. I think the desire to go overseas to explore never ceases throughout human generation. But second, is there a good alternative? They say that we place an unfair burden to them. But I want to say that outside opposition is representing the people of Macau, representing the people of Maldives who currently have a job now, who are currently better paid than maybe some of the Americans out there. We definitely need to be accountable to these group of people. The government needs to explain to the people why is it that currently when there are no signs of the economic shrinking when it comes to tourism, that we are not making the full use and the maximum use of this industry, milk the cash cow as much as possible and to distribute these benefits to people. The government needs to explain to the people why are we not making optimum use of the people, optimum use of the industry, the tourism industry, to benefit for the people. When right now there's a viable way to do so. The reason why some of these industries are not naturally gravitating towards other industries to begin with, like we pointed out, it's because maybe they don't have a natural advantage. But as compared to other countries who have their competitive advantage in maybe the port industry or maybe in the manufacturing industry, and they also lose out to other countries because the other countries have the first mover advantage. They are already so established, like Silicon Valley is so established in the IT industry. It's very difficult for them to say, I want to move out just because I want to move out. You need a stable plan to account to your people. For all these reasons, they failed to protect the environment, and they failed to tell us why we want to let the tourism industry die and decline away. Let's go with the side of opposition.
We take the opposition whip, we follow the opposition reply.
Madam Chair, this is what the second speaker told you. You offer them a chance to be more than tour guides and chefs. Sure, being jobless is a job itself, right? Because you make an awesome creme brulee, but you don't know how to pick cotton, and you don't know how to work in a factory. That's the structural unemployment we were talking about earlier on. So when you move to an industry, when you move from one industry to another industry, you better well be able to sustain that, because you are not able to sustain what you have right now, right? But when you are able to sustain what you have right now in terms of economic tourism, in terms of tourism-related economies, then why would you move? What is the necessity of movement? Because that's the real question that they needed to ask and they needed to answer. And we said that there is really no need to move, especially in countries like Maldives, especially in states like Hawaii, especially in locations like special economic locations like Las Vegas. There is no need to move from tourism-related economies because it's doing just fine. It's creating revenue, it is the cash cow, it's providing you jobs, it's providing you benefits, you are able to sustain on that. Because this is the one problem they had all the while. They said that they are going to do a vulnerability analysis. They said that the recession and saturation rate recession and saturation was the Achilles heel of tourism-related economies. Just one question to that. Earlier on we asked, tell us why all those things won't affect the new suggested strategy that you are saying. Why won't recession affect, let's say, industries? Why won't recession affect, let's say, manufacturing? Because if you can't answer that, then you have lost. And that's exactly what they were unable to do. How did we respond to that? We said that the recession does never hit tourism as badly. We pointed at the places where they pointed at. We talked about Maldives. We even introduced Las Vegas. We talked about Sentosa in Singapore. Because these areas were continuously being flooded by tourists who were not affected by the recession. Like tourists from China, tourists from India, hell, tourists from Macau also were coming to Sentosa. So when you are saying that this is a particular industry that is kind of away from the global recession problem, then there is something important that you need to hold on to. So we suggested that we can hold to that. Then we said that moving from the industry or moving from an economic strategy that you're very well aware of to another one is basically dangerous because you don't have the first mover advantage. Because you're now competing, for example, in manufacturing, you're now competing with China. For example, in IT, you're now going to compete with countries like India. And so if you don't have that advantage, then you're necessarily going to be on a back foot when you start off that economy. So it's dangerous. Then we said that there's a risk to the environment. Because yes, the risk to the environment is in order to create these infrastructure of manufacturing or services, you're going to cut down the forests that you were preserving earlier. Because you would preserve the economic, if there's ecotourism, you will preserve these forests because it's in your best interest. Because if people don't want to come to your virgin forest, then if people are liking to flood to your virgin forest, then you will make sure that they are continuously virgins. Then that's exactly the point. Because that's what interests them. And so you'll maintain those forests. You're more likely to maintain those forests, you're more likely to pump infrastructure to keep those forests alive. So economic tourism is actually a good thing for the environment. That's what we argue. Then we said that this tourism is non-volatile. It will not, your beaches and your historic sites will never go away, unless of course miraculously you're underground. Or you're flooded and you drown. Because that's not going to happen, right? At least not in the near future. And even if it does happen, that's something out of our control. We can't say anything about it. We said that's non-volatile. We said you can innovate regularly within those regions and it won't be affected by recession. So, in a sense, when you have a strategy that is good for you, don't move. Keep there because you need to sustain your economic growth. We are very proud to oppose.
We thank the opposition your side. We call them the government your side.
Madam Chair, the biggest thing that the side of the House completely missed out is this. That cash cow that they kept on talking about isn't going to be a cash cow for long. That cash cow that they kept on talking about, that they wanted to depend on so much, they could never prove that they can identify when the cash cow will go dry. That's the problem, Madam Chair. When you have an investment heavily dependent on something so inflexible, when the cash cow does die off, Madam Chair, when you have, for example, a financial crisis that prevents people to spend on luxury, when you have a tidal wave, for example, in Phuket, you no longer, Madam Chair, have an ability to move that capital elsewhere. Which is why we think it's necessary for them to realize that those are situations that they are going to have to counter. But let's look at the three things that I'll talk to you at this in reply to show you how affirmative won this debate clearly. First thing, a lot of the things that they kept on pursuing in today's debate aren't mutually exclusive. Things like, for example, employment and how it's expensive to move away from tourism because the capital is already invested somewhere. Never mind, I said it's going to take a couple of years, actually a long, long process to move away from this. We're not expecting you to start tearing down your hotel just for fun and then move away somewhere and just figure it out after that. No, Madam Chair, it's a long process where you're going to be able to shift your capital somewhere else, which is going to be more stable for your entire country. The negative said, they can afford tax cuts and incentives to create more tourist spots. So simple, you funnel those things away from these tourist spots, you funnel away these things and move it towards a capital that's something that you can depend on in certain situations. But then they said there's no signs that ecotourism will lose money anytime soon. Madam Chair, we said that's entirely the problem. People don't see when you're going to lose money from ecotourism, mostly because it's impossible to identify. Where are you vulnerable? You're vulnerable for markets crashing, Madam Chair, which you can never predict. You're vulnerable with a lot of environmental degradation that you can never predict, Madam Chair. Which is why when it does hit, it hits you hard and you have no way to move out of it because you're dependent on one thing only, Madam Chair. And that's something that we've been saying all along that they completely missed out, Madam Chair. The next idea is that they have very delusional argumentations. First thing, that it's enough that you push up prices and then push down prices, people will start going back to these places. When you're pushing down the prices of these hotels, the prices for food will also get pushed down because everybody's budget is going down, Madam Chair, meaning prioritization will never change just because you have discounts in the end. The reality of it is, Madam Chair, even if you have Americans having bigger problems with their finances and you have Indians out there willing to go to these areas, that's not the point. Because even if you have rich individuals, the top class of those countries, that doesn't mean that the middle class is capable to be able to enter these markets. Why is that so important? You can't depend on an industry that's completely dependent on the top classes of each nation, Madam Chair. You make the most money with the middle class when they feel that they have the capacity to take on certain luxurious things. But then what are the things that they never responded to coming from our side? That you have to have markets that are self-sustainable, Madam Chair. You can't give examples like that of Singapore or that of Australia with the Great Reef because those aren't countries that are dependent on tourism, Madam Chair. That's why they were able to survive. But when we're talking about the Maldives and Argentina, Madam Chair, these are countries that are extremely different in nature. A lot of the times, you need to have them to sustain yourself, and that's why it's going to be extremely difficult to get out of the situation. But beyond that, we told you that there are environmental harms to cultural heritage, Madam Chair. And this is the nuance we completely missed out. Because they just rebutted it by saying, well, you're also going to be cutting down trees for every single other form of economic development. Madam Chair, you don't need to cut down areas that are already virgin rainforests, Madam Chair. Those are areas specifically we think must be preserved and must be given priority to. And you cannot do that if you're going to ecotourism, Madam Chair, simply because it's all about competing about the specialness of the location. You need these areas, that's why they will get abused the most. Thank you.
Here, here.